Sup, chooms, how y'all living? Hope everything is Nova and you're all having a preem week. So, have you ever wondered how it is that the belief in Post Finasteride Syndrome has become so prevalent on the internet? A lot of times, the internet, it can leave an impression that what we're seeing is the truth just due to the sheer ubiquity of all the information we're receiving. However, you have to remember that medicine, it really is a form of science, and in science, facts are never democratic. Just because the majority of information you see online about finasteride is hysterical fear-mongering does not make that hysterical fear-mongering true. In a democracy, all voices are equal, but in science, some voices are more equal than others. So, people will often attack me and other finasteride users by saying that we're crazy to say that post-finasteride syndrome isn't real, but you may be surprised to hear that the notion that post-finasteride syndrome is a myth is actually the mainstream opinion amongst most medical professionals. This isn't reflected well on internet forums or social media because medical professionals write their opinions in manuscripts and scientific journals. They're not off ranting like lunatics on hair loss forums about how finasteride inverted their penis or changed their sexual orientation. Since reading and interpreting scientific journals takes both skill and effort, this results in emotional, fact-free points taking precedent over actual scientific research. There is a curious metaphor which explains this information paradox with finasteride. It's called the squeaky wheel gets the grease. What that means is that the loudest voice expressing the most noticeable problems get the most attention. This makes sense because the majority of people who use finasteride have a good experience with the drug. We know this based on clinical trials which prove that the overwhelming majority of people who use the drug will have no problems whatsoever. These people, they don't usually go online to talk about their amazing experience. They just take the drug and they get on with their lives. Those who feel slighted by the drug or who feel too scared to use the drug will feel that they have to spread as much fear and misinformation about it as possible as a means of coping with their decision not to use it. This results in an informational vacuum which makes finding quality information about finasteride almost impossible these days. No doubt many people have sadly gone bald as a consequence of this rampant misinformation when chances are they would have responded just fine to finasteride and would be enjoying a much higher quality of life today had they known the truth about finasteride's safety profile. That's what I am here for, to make sure that people know what the scientific consensus is and what the best data on this subject really shows. So, when I am talking about the scientific consensus, what I mean is that most of the research, as well as most researchers, agree that post-finasteride syndrome isn't real, or at the very least, it just lacks scientific support for its existence. Until recently, we haven't had any real data as to what percentage of doctors actually believe in post-finasteride syndrome. That's all changed now, though, thanks to our good friend Dr. Irwig. So, just a few days ago, a study was published by Dr. Irwig that looked at what percentage of dermatologists actually believe in post-finasteride syndrome, also known as PFS. So, a little background on Dr. Irwig. He is one of the very few doctors who, along with Dr. Trash, are the leading proponents of the post-finasteride syndrome conspiracy theory. Their research on PFS is extremely flawed by selection bias issues, since they like to recruit subjects from anti-finasteride organizations like Propecia Help, and they also have the propensity to use the same subjects over and over again in their research so they can come to the same flawed conclusions. Bottom line is that these investigators set out their research with the goal of making finasteride look bad before they even conduct their studies. That is why these studies are funded by the PFS network, because these doctors, they are basically just employees of the PFS network, and they are tasked with creating propaganda that the PFS network can use to pursue their litigious agenda against pharmaceutical corporation. I have made videos debunking all of their research on PFS, and I'll link those videos below for your viewing pleasure. As we'll soon see, Dr. Irwig, he probably conducted this study hoping the outcome would have been different. So no doubt, being that he's on the PFS network's payroll, he's probably disappointed with the results of the study, but at least he went ahead and published it anyways. Here's the study in question. It is brand new and therefore it is behind a paywall, but don't worry, chooms. I recently completed a monster contract, so the Haircafe Institute of Hair Loss Research located at Kaer received extra donations this month, so I am willing to go the extra mile and pay the price to download this article so I can keep other hair loss witchers up to date. Well, Dr. Irwig starts out by listing all the potential side effects of finasteride. Some of them, like low libido and sexual dysfunction, can occur, though they are rare, with most studies showing an increased and absolute risk of about 2%. These side effects are not just rare, but they go away even while continuing to use the drug in at least 50% of people, and none of these side effects were felt to be persistent in the original clinical studies of the drug. He also mentions depression and suicidal ideation, which have only been added to the package insert after pressure from the PFS network, even though the FDA found no convincing link between finasteride and these problems. The same goes for persistent sexual dysfunction, which Dr. Irwig is of course a big believer in. Anyways, Dr. Irwig notes that there are several papers that question the existence of post-finasteride syndrome, so he decided to do this study in order to find out how many dermatologists actually believe that post-finasteride syndrome is a real thing. What he did is he did an anonymous survey of dermatologists who were attending 2 large national conferences on dermatology. He asked 122 dermatologists to do the survey, and 100 actually filled it out, which isn't too bad of a response rate. Of these responders, 47% were women and 77% were from the United States. 39% of the responders were dermatologists in training, so these responders probably were less experienced than the dermatologists in practice. However, dermatologists in training are still usually pretty up to date on current research since they are studying to take their board exams. However, the majority of the responders were actually practicing dermatologists. The first interesting result was that about 75 to 80% of these dermatologists had never even seen a patient claiming to have persistent side effects from finasteride. If you read the hair loss forums, you'd think this was something that would come up all the time for dermatologists, but apparently that's not the case at all, which further reinforces the squeaky wheel metaphor I mentioned at the beginning of this video. So, this table lists the actual results. The most interesting finding is that only 18% of dermatologists surveyed felt that finasteride could cause persistent sexual side effects. In addition, less than a quarter of the dermatologists believed that finasteride could cause depression. So, these are things I have been saying on my channel all along, and I have been castigated for it, not just by anti-finasteride hating communities like the PFS network, but even large hair loss communities like the Trestless subreddit trash me for this position all the time. But as I just demonstrated, this isn't just my opinion. My views reflect the mainstream opinion of most dermatologists. So you guys who are getting mad at me aren't realizing that I am just the messenger here. I just happen to share the same opinion as most dermatologists on this particular issue. Dr. Irwig felt that the reason most dermatologists didn't believe in post-finasteride syndrome was due to these dermatologists being ignorant of the brilliant work that he and Dr. Trash have done in promoting post-finasteride syndrome. However, one of the survey questions was on whether these doctors had read articles on the adverse effects of finasteride, and 82% of these doctors reported that yes, they had read those articles. So Dr. Irwig was forced to admit that these doctors were aware of the data on PFS, but were just skeptical of this data. So it's not like the doctors aren't aware of the research on PFS, they just think that it's bullshit like me. So once again, all of you guys getting triggered at my PFS skepticism are forgetting that my opinion represents the scientific consensus on this issue. If you disagree with me, you should take it up with doctors like Dr. Trüeb or Dr. Sinclair. These are 2 of the most accomplished hair loss researchers in the entire world, and neither of them take post-finasteride syndrome seriously, and that's just 2 examples. Again, I remind you that Dr. Irwig has confirmed the overwhelming majority of doctors do not believe in post-finasteride syndrome. So, despite the skepticism about PFS from these doctors in the study, they actually frequently counseled patients ahead of time about the possibility of depression or persistent side effects, even though most of them don't really believe in them being real side effects. This is easily explainable though, especially for doctors who practice in the United States, since doctors have to worry about bullshit medical malpractice lawsuits all the time. So anything on the package insert still needs to be conveyed to the patients before starting a drug, regardless of whether or not there is scientific evidence for these side effects. As I have explained many times, there is no scientific evidence for persistent side effects or cognitive side effects like depression. These side effects were added due to social and legal pressure, even though the FDA does not feel there is sufficient evidence to justify either of these labelings. So naturally, Dr. Irwig thinks he's smarter than everyone else, and he thinks that this data shows that doctors are just too stupid to understand the data, and that doctors need a greater awareness of his brilliant research behind post-finasteride syndrome. This is a really big problem with the PFS community in general. They're the medical equivalents of Neon Genesis Evangelion fans. They think that everybody who doesn't like their pretentious bullshit is just too stupid to understand its brilliance, when the reality is we just see it for what it truly is: pretentious bullshit. This article shows that the majority of dermatologists are well aware of the studies published on PFS, and they have a realistic view of PFS, meaning they are skeptical. It is clear from all of this that the majority of dermatologists do not believe in post-finasteride syndrome. That's something you would find hard to believe if you just read the hair loss forums, but that's another good reason to avoid hair loss forums. And that's because finasteride fearmongers sadly control the narrative there, and the people who run the forums don't do nearly enough to moderate the quality of the content which gets posted there, which ends up making hair loss forums counterproductive and more likely to make you end up going bald due to all the misinformation. I am not a doctor, but I have a great reverence for doctors and their research, and all the research I post here is posted with the intention of showing what the scientific consensus is, and the scientific consensus is that post-finasteride syndrome is not real. Until next time, hair loss witchers, God bless.